Well guys, we have regrettably made it to what I like to call the non-Team Silent era in the Silent Hill timeline, an age that would see Konami separating the team that brought them financial success in the hopes of essentially subcontracting the series out to any dev house with an email address. And if it wasn't apparent in my voice already, I am not a huge fan of what happened next. That being said, I did endeavor to cover all of the Silent Hill games, and well, I'll be damned if I'm not going to do just that. Besides, maybe I'll end up liking some of these games. Hell, I never thought I'd enjoy RE6, but being forced to play through titles I wouldn't otherwise touch has broadened my horizons somewhat. And in that vein, let's take a look at the first mobile title in the series if you don't count the GBA Play novel. Silent Hill Origins would serve as a bit of a taste test in regards to what we could expect from Konami's new practices, and, well, it didn't exactly taste good. So I hope you're ready for a trip back to that old rickety town in the hopes of explaining everything that led up to our first journey through the other world. Ladies, gentlemen, welcome to Silent Hill. The Silent Hill Origins development cycle was a very Capcom-esque type of debacle, and what I mean by that is it was a complete and unmitigated disaster, which you would have to assume given Konami had just franchised this series out to a studio that up to this point had developed almost no games worth talking about, with the exception of Sudeki, a game that everyone agrees existed. With Climax LA working on a game series that was pretty well based in a foreign understanding of American horror, well, you could understand why the fan base would be a smidge worried. And, well, the company didn't do much to quell those worries when early info pegged the game as a kind of dark comedy, which is insane for an infinite amount of reasons. But on the other hand, this was going to be a PSP game, and the idea of playing a cool survival horror title on the go was pretty damn attractive. Sadly, a cool idea wasn't enough to float the studio through working on hardware they weren't familiar with, and in the process, Climax LA ended up closing its doors, passing their work on to Climax's UK studio. And despite whatever gripes I may have with the finished product, I have to give props to this team for fixing the utter travesty Origins was shaping up to be. The LA Studios build of the game was an absolute joke and seemed to be trying a little too hard to be the next RE4. Hold on, I'm sorry, I misspoke there. It was trying a little too hard to be RE4. The footage you're looking at now is from a preview build of the game, and trust me, it is every bit as bad as it looks. Now, it's worth saying my harsh judgments come from the perspective of someone who was expecting a Silent Hill game. As a standalone horror title, honestly, this could have been interesting. I feel like there's a real lack of third-person shooters on the console, and I'm a sucker for good horror games. But Climax wasn't looking to make a horror-based third-person shooter. They were trying to make a Silent Hill game, and it was very clear that they were failing miserably. But Climax UK took over the project and, to their credit, did a very commendable job shaping it into something much more comparable to the other games in the series. And as you know, SH games live and die by their stories, so there's no doubt these guys understood the source material, right?
Lisa.
Travis.
Origins, as the name would suggest, serves as an origin story for all the characters and events that led up to the first Silent Hill game, and uses Travis Grady as a vehicle to tell that story. One night, Travis is driving through Silent Hill, and in a bout of, we couldn't think of a better way to start this game, so basically here's the beginning of SH1, Travis has to slam on brakes to avoid hitting an apparition of Alessa. He then for some reason gets out of his truck and chases her down, till he stumbles upon Alessa's house, which is now on fire. Now, Silent Hill fans were likely very excited at the prospect of exploring events that, up until now, had only been mentioned in notes and newspaper articles, but it's very clear Climax didn't really understand Silent Hill's story quite as much as they thought, and these very first moments will do a great job at preparing you for the inaccurate fan theory level analysis you can expect going forward. So our boy Travis braves the flames and finds Alessa's charred but still living body. Now, you may have expected this to be a cathartic moment, actually being able to take part in the events that landed this girl in her magically induced coma, but right off the bat it seems like Climax is among those who believes Alessa was burned on purpose.
Why did no one help? You all left that girl to burn.
So we did.
Which might have something to do with a file that explains these circumstances not being easily found in certain versions of the PS1 original. To give a very, very brief summary of the events, this was not a case of Dahlia burning her daughter to death on purpose, because of course it isn't. The plan was always to have Alessa get pregnant with the malevolent demon and bring him to term, physically birthing him into the world with her psychic powers, allowing that process to take place.
Herein lies the mother's womb, containing the power to create life.
Besides, if you'll remember, Alessa's current charred state is actually what put a damper on the process in the first place and allowed her to split her consciousness. So clearly a blaze taking out 5 or 6 houses in the neighborhood was not on the itinerary for these people. Now, I completely understand if you don't think this is the hill I should die on, but what actually happened, and has been documented very clearly in Silent Hill 1, is the ritual to impregnate her caused Alessa to unwillingly manifest her psychic abilities, stressing an old antiquated boiler in her basement. And this can be confirmed when Silent Hill firefighters or cops cite the basement as the origin of the blaze, which contradicts this game's opening, seeing as how Travis rescues her from the second floor. Anyways, back to the actual game. Travis reaches down to help her, but it seems like Alessa doesn't want to be saved. On the way out, she uses her powers to help Travis, kind of running counter to her request to be allowed to die, and for some reason uses the seal of Metatron here. Upon reaching safety, Travis falls unconscious and wakes up in the fog-ridden town, wondering what the hell happened to the girl he saved. After hoofing it to the hospital, we talk to Michael Kaufman, and it seems clear he's hiding something, because he's always hiding something. Well, upon further inspection, Travis finds the hospital to be filled with hellish creatures, including busty nurses, because of course it is.
You okay?
This being a Silent Hill game made by people who severely lack an understanding of the series lore and what monsters are supposed to represent. From here, we learn that Travis can actually control when he crosses into the other world, a mechanic we will definitely dive deeper into a bit later. After he searched the place, Travis falls unconscious again and wakes back up in the regular world, a theme that repeats itself throughout the entire game's runtime. The general pattern is, Travis gets an idea to go to a place, and then he gets there, searches it for more clues, fights a boss, then passes out as Alessa's projection gets near him. Wash, rinse, repeat, over and over again. Of course, while the main mystery of Alessa and Silent Hill's cult is being solved, Origin sees Travis unravel his own personal issues, which leads right back to my main criticism for these post-Team Silent games. But it's here where I have to give a bit of a spoiler warning. We're going to be going pretty in-depth, and there's a chance I might ruin either this game's story or some elements from the originals. So click on the timestamp on screen or follow the link in the description to keep from fracturing the space-time continuum due to forbidden knowledge. For some reason I will never understand, Silent Hill 2 has become the standard that the rest of the series should be held to, despite it having almost nothing to do with the overall Silent Hill lore. Now don't get me wrong, the first time I played through James's insanely touching trek through his own fractured psyche caused by him killing his own sick wife, well, I was drawn in for every second of it, but that trick only works once. Every single developer that has ever touched this franchise since the release of Silent Hill 2 have all believed this to be the desired format, despite it differing vastly from the other 3 entries in the series, and sadly, Climax is no different. Throughout the game, Travis gets these odd flashbacks to past events in his life, mostly concerning his parents who died at an early age. Of course, as dictated by international law, Travis, being an SH main character, has to navigate the town of Silent Hill as it presents him with aspects of his own mental baggage till he remembers some traumatic event and then comes to grips with it. A little ditty I like to call the Sunderland Sun Dance. The tragic event this time around is that his mother went crazy when he was young and tried to kill him. Oh, and his dad hung himself. Now, I'm not saying this isn't an interesting little twist to find, but like I said before, the old SH2 trick only works once. As the game progresses, it becomes painfully clear they're just aping every single element of 2 they could, and hell, there's even a giant monster following Travis around while doing messed up things to the town's monsters and carrying an oversized weapon, being clothed in butcher's attire. Listen, I know I'm not in the majority with how much I criticize Silent Hill 2, but like I've said a million times, it's still an amazing game. It was a real masterwork of storytelling, and even though it was a clear spin-off type of scenario, it served a very, very vital purpose. That being filling out the world of Silent Hill without having a major impact on the story at large. This approach is only retroactively degraded after every single, and I literally mean every single game released since The Room, has included a main character with a troubled past who needs to travel through Silent Hill encountering aspects of his repressed memories until he remembers and confronts those memories. Honestly, looking back, I think I just described the plots of Silent Hill's Origin, Homecoming, Downpour, and Book of Memories, which seems like a really big missed opportunity. I mean, the world of Silent Hill allows all kinds of amazingly supernatural things to happen, but anyone who touches this series seems to only be interested in having the town serve as some kind of psychiatrist and its spiritual power be used to help people face their inner demons. And yeah, at one point this was a very novel approach, but trust me, it is an effect that is greatly diminished over countless repetitions. That being said, this is by no means a bad story. I wasn't really expecting much, but there were moments when the game really immersed me into its world. I really do like the idea of taking part in events that led up to Silent Hill 1, and this game helps iron out details you might have wondered about, like who saved Alessa from the fire, how was she able to separate her consciousness while under the control of the cult. The only issue is, even your more fair-weather fan of the series is going to be able to spot some huge inaccuracies and even bigger plot holes. Like, how is Travis able to cross into the other world when Alessa wasn't able to create it yet, as her powers are being held at bay until the events at the end of the game? On top of that, the familiar characters that you'd be excited to interact with all act well outside their established personalities, and it's all these storyline mistakes and altered characters that made me assume this was a reboot type of deal. And maybe that was the idea at one point, but everything I've been able to dig up on the game states very clearly that it's meant to tell players what happened before Silent Hill 1. Sometimes it's just better to assume ignorance, and well, that's what I'm doing here. I don't think the guys at Climax were looking to rewrite the series' lore. I think they just didn't understand the original game's events very well, and were probably making things up as they came to an element they couldn't explain. A practice that should look very familiar, since it's exactly what most fans do when creating theories for things that have already been explained in the games. Look, I know I've been using Origin's inaccurate ties to the rest of the series as my main point of criticism, but if you're not actually familiar with those games, you might get into this one. It's plenty dark and deals with some pretty disturbing subject matter, and I think it's mostly the elements taken from the main series that gives this story its relatively effective feel. So I guess if you're just a fan of Silent Hill's world and you're looking for another glimpse into it, you could certainly do worse than Origins. Most of my issues stem from how many liberties are taken with established canon, but I'm self-aware enough to know that's just a personal bias of mine. You may very well enjoy a tale like this, and if you've sort of forgotten most of the events in the series, this might be a pretty damn enjoyable experience. For me though, it was a chore to get through. I didn't really like Travis as a character, and the changes made to already existing SH characters kind of made them unattractive as well. The twist about Travis's past has a good amount of pacing, and especially in the sanitarium is really well introduced. At first, I thought all the files I was reading were just random stories of patients there, not some overarching narrative about our main character. Aside from that though, this was a mostly blah kind of story for me. It's not what I would call an insult to the art of storytelling, but it's not the best thing either. So I guess come for the gameplay, and if you like the story, well hey, that's just icing on the cake. Gameplay-wise, Origins does just as good of a job at emulating OG Silent Hill as it does completely missing the mark. I mean, on the surface, there's a lot to lead you to believe this is a game in the same vein as the original. After all, you do explore the town of Silent Hill, find a place of interest, run between this world and the other world collecting info and items that'll allow you to backtrack and uncover more info and items. Which, don't get me wrong, is actually satisfying as hell, but it's everything in between that's been tweaked to a point that fans are no longer going to be able to recognize it. The first major issue for me were the controls. Now, you guys know I'm an avid supporter of tank controls. I don't know why, but that kind of setup is just intuitive as hell for me. So yes, I would have preferred a tank control option, but games like Silent Hill 3 have implemented really effective control schemes that work more akin to your modern 3D style, so it is indeed possible. It just seems like Climax wasn't up to that task. Origins controls terribly in my opinion, and I think that's because these guys refused to pick a side. They wanted the more modern control scheme, but also wanted to keep the rapidly changing fixed camera angles that are more traditionally seen in the genre. Which, hey, you know I love a well-placed camera system, but the benefit of tank controls is you always know which direction is forward. Origins likes to switch camera orientation often, and with its controls, that means whatever direction was forward for you before the switch might be a completely different direction after. I can't tell you how many times I was running near one of these collapsed portions of a road and had to actively fight to get back out of the fixed camera area. Of course, it would be unfair not to mention that this game uses a system that'll maintain your controls after a camera angle change as long as you keep holding that direction. But once you let it go or move the stick just a bit off axis, bam, you're headed in a different direction, oftentimes leading right out of the camera angle. And this tedious process repeats itself often. The frustrating controls also give way to some very awkward combat. First and foremost, we have to talk about the big idea Origins has built its gameplay around. Instead of following the other games in the series, Origins has you finding hundreds of different kinds of melee weapons, all of which degrade with use. Meaning instead of finding and relying on the most powerful weapon in your arsenal, you'll be smacking enemies with IV stands till they break, and then switch into a portable CRT. Listen, I don't think breakable weapon systems are inherently bad. There are a few choice games that have done really well making that type of mechanic work, but almost all of them allow you to fix your weapons to avoid them permanently breaking. I think the developers wanted to make the weapons act as a stressor for the player. Like you would walk into an area, take out a few monsters, and then you'd have to scramble for something in the environment like a pipe or a broken piece of wood, which on the surface sounds like a really good idea. In theory, this would make for a pretty tense time, but Climax sort of bungled the implementation. Instead of dynamically controlling how many options the player has at any time, Origins accounts for the lowest possible skill level of the player and scatters a near infinite amount of melee weapons in every area. And instead of relying on what's at hand, you'll be cycling through more than 50 options till you find that one katana you remembered picking up at some point. After the halfway point, I started using the secret unlockable weapons that come from beating the game only because they didn't degrade, and you know what? It was a much more fun experience. Now, I know what you're probably thinking, if the combat's a chore, this is a Silent Hill game, why not just avoid the enemies? And that's what I tried to do for most of the second area, but Climax has made one small tweak to traditional SH combat that makes avoiding it a much worse choice than engaging in it. In the original Silent Hill games, you could navigate the environment running past most monsters, picking and choosing exactly where to use your precious resources. It was a game of risk versus reward, since a monster in a hallway might take a few hits and maybe a health item to take down, but at least you wouldn't have to worry about dodging one of their melee attacks as you crisscross the map, constantly running by them. Well, enemies in Origins all have grab attacks that will instantly teleport them onto you, and these can be initiated with little to no visible windup. That means unless you're out in the wide open streets of the town, your best bet is to down every enemy you come across. Either that or chance them grabbing onto you every time you cross them. But in their defense, they do allow you to shake enemies off, sadly using QuickTime button sequences, which makes the saddening first appearance of QTEs in a Silent Hill game so far. But since some enemies require some button mashing and others have random button cues, it's pretty easy to take a few cheap hits from these attacks. And adding insult to injury, once you do clear an area out, there are respawns that seem to happen at random, leading to me running out of healing items on several occasions despite using the powerful New Game Plus weapons. And in a survival horror game, this would be the desired effect, having the player always running low on supplies, but if 90% of the damage you take comes from cheap hits due to enemies grabbing you out of nowhere or running right into melee attacks thanks to the terrible controls, well, we've officially left the territory of tense horror gameplay and entered the world of frustrating game design elements. But let's move away from the more outwardly annoying stuff and move into the more subtle ways that Origins actually does well. If there's one thing Origins gets right, it's exploration. Areas in this game are fun to explore and their atmosphere feels incredibly authentic given the source material they're working from. I really liked seeing more of this foggy town, and the game does a good job of providing a bit of fan service alongside new and interesting locations. And if you'll remember, the original Silent Hill games used the Otherworld as a way to alter the environment around the player, effectively doubling the size of any area. Typically, you would explore a location in the town, and then at a fixed point, the Otherworld would take over, forcing you to find new routes and allowing you to access more of the map. Well, Origins has a similar take on the practice, but with one giant alteration. As the player, you are free to initiate these Otherworld transitions whenever you want, as long as you can get to a mirror. Now on the surface, I'm sure that doesn't seem like a big deal at all, but it radically changes the flow your typical SH fan will have been used to. Instead of forcing the player to forge new paths and discover new items, the other world is used almost as a puzzle element. Instead of exploring each version of the world separately, Travis moves between the two at will, and that means using this mechanic as a progress further button. In the other world, doors that were locked might be open now, and these new areas might have key items to be found. It essentially plays directly into exploring one area instead of compartmentalizing that process into two separate individual experiences. I'm not sure why, but this seemed to cause me to grow pretty fatigued with exploration towards the end of any location, but I will admit it does make for an interesting little twist. The purist in me doesn't like such a big change, but realistically I think it works really well at turning the entire environment into a puzzle. I'm kind of torn, because on one end, it does seem to make each area feel a little too long, but it also forced me to think outside the box and made for a really interesting way to explore the environment. Of course, this game was a portable title first and foremost, and I would be letting you guys down if I didn't cover how it played on its home console, the PSP. And in an odd turn of events, I find the PSP version of Origins to be much easier to play for a multitude of reasons. First off is the controls, which just seem to work better on the PSP. I can't really quantify exactly what's going on, but it's a noticeable difference. And complementing the controls is a frame rate that somehow runs smoother than the console port. Sure, there were still dips here and there, but this game feels like it runs at or near 60 frames per second most of the time. Of course, you do have to factor in how cramped the physical controls can be on a PSP, so you may not want to play this one for hours on end. But in its defense, Origins is a pretty easy game to pick up, make some progress, and then put back down again. Now, I know I just front-loaded a lot of complaints, but that's because everything outside of the complaints is pretty damn close to an authentic Silent Hill experience. I remember my first time playing the PSP version of this game, marveling at how close it got to the real SH kind of feeling. I mean, sure, the explorable parts of the town had to be trimmed down to keep it working on such a low-power platform, and yeah, that does feel a little odd on the PS2 version, but it really does come within inches of feeling like a real SH game. The puzzles will definitely have you scratching your head, and the environments are pretty damn interesting. I may not be the biggest fan of the story itself, but the exposition and cutscenes are spread evenly across each area, so you always feel like you're making forward progress. And it's always exciting going back into the streets of Silent Hill and finding more of the town to explore. I know I went pretty hard on the game at the start here, but rest assured, even in the face of those downsides, this game will rekindle a bit of that old SH nostalgia you have deep in you. And yeah, you may be frustrated the entire time, but at this point, beggars most certainly can't be choosers. So yeah, this might not be the best Silent Hill game ever made, but it's definitely not the worst either. If you've grown disillusioned with the modern SH series, but are still looking for that familiar psychological horror experience, well, you could do much worse than picking up Silent Hill Origins.
You have a habit of popping up where you're not wanted, Mr. Grady. Isn't it time you left town?
So even though Origins started out as a PSP title, there's still a good amount to talk about graphically speaking. I mean, the PSP was a surprisingly powerful handheld at the time, and I think games like Origins really shows that off. But first we gotta talk about the PS2 release, since that's where I spent most of my time this playthrough. And the first thing we gotta talk about is the static filter. As you guys might know by now, I'm a bit of a series heretic since I really don't like these static overlays in SH games, and whenever possible I will turn them off. I know it's supposed to be a defining look for these games, but this just looks ugly as hell to me, and I'd rather see the game's artistry without any obstructions. The only issue with this is, Origin only unlocks this feature after you've beaten the game, so I had to resort to a bit of trickery. On the PSP, it was easy enough to get going since I just had to download a save file, plug my PSP into my PC, and drag it over, but I didn't know if I could do something similar with the PS2. Well, thanks to the custom firmware FreeMcBoot, I was able to download a save file, use a special program that unpacks all the file's contents, transfer it to USB, and use the file browser from FreeMcBoot to transfer the save file to my memory card, which took a bit of trial and error, but actually worked really well. So regardless of whether you're playing on the PSP or PS2, make sure to import a save file from the internet with one clear game already on it, so you can disable that static filter. I have heard this effect is a little easier on the eyes when viewed on a CRT, but until I find a quality PVM or BVM, I'm not going to be able to test that myself. And with that issue out of the way, it is clear there have been some serious upgrades in texture resolution and 3D model complexity from the PSP original. Lighting and contrast have also been tweaked, but sadly that did not end up working in the game's favor. While the PSP version was pretty damn dark, it seems like the PS2 release is much darker. You're likely going to struggle trying to see anything outside of your flashlight's cone once you're inside of one of Silent Hill's buildings. But if you ask me, this actually helps add to the atmosphere. Sure, you might miss a few items on the floor, but I was able to play through the game without an issue, honestly. The only time this really becomes a problem is when you're recording footage for a YouTube video, since compression artifacts are much more visible in darker areas, and the method Google uses to compress and display all the video uploaded to YouTube can cause a loss in color information on dark screens. Of course, I would turn up the brightness in the game's options, but apparently this is something that Climax thought didn't deserve to make the transition over to the PS2. And if I increase brightness a little too much here in the editing software, it's just going to mess up the picture, so let's go ahead and just leave it dark. On the brighter side, I really like the way items move back and forth on your screen once you've picked them up. But going back to the complaints again, I really don't like how using the D-pad to switch weapons brings up an ugly weapons inventory. Listen, I've said it 1,000 times by now, but the real appeal with survival horror games is how immersive they are. The effect is lost if you don't feel like you're in the game's world, and in my opinion, the fastest way to ruin immersion is to show QTE-style button prompts or inventory elements on screen. Especially after you've collected damn near 100 melee weapons, you'll be sorting through this thing for hours. As far as the town itself goes, I think this is a pretty respectful rendition of old Silent Hill. It's certainly been simplified thanks to Origin's handheld, Origins, but it still looks great to me. Level geometry can be a little simplistic, but textures in the PS2 version are high-res enough that the town ends up looking really convincing. Most of the game's cutscenes are in-engine, which is always good in a Silent Hill game, and after playing parts 2 and 3, it's pretty damn cool seeing a per-pixel lighting implementation for Travis's flashlight, as opposed to the other games in the series using a per-vertex style. The only issue with that being shadows cast by it can be very blocky and aliased looking. In most rooms and hallways, this is a non-issue, but when you walk into an area with a lot of set dressing, you'll notice a kind of shimmering effect on the background from all the moving aliased edges. Monsters in the game look relatively okay enough, but they all seem to be takes on previous series monsters, specifically the bubblehead nurses and lying figures. To me, this kind of shows that Climax were at least familiar with some of the surface level SH elements, but not enough to understand that enemies in the game should reflect fears and negative emotions from within the character's own psyche. It seems to me these guys were just kind of throwing in monsters everyone would be familiar with, a practice we are going to see repeat itself many times as this retrospective goes on. All in all, this is a pretty good looking PS2 game. Of course, it doesn't hold a candle to games that are native to the platform, since they didn't have to make any concessions due to development on a handheld, but it still looks great to my eye. Of course, it helps that it brings some advantages over the original games like a per-pixel flashlight illumination code and really fluid animations. But it also brings a few other things to the table, and included in that is really odd graphical glitches. For some reason, I found that in this version of the game, when you reload any gun from the menu, the weapon's image will turn into the last gun you had equipped. Now, as far as I've been able to see, this is merely visual and doesn't carry over into actual gameplay, but it seems like a pretty easy bug to catch, so I gotta assume no one playtested this PS2 release. That being said, as far as bugs go, this is a relatively benign one. And with all that out of the way, let's take a look at the original release of the game on the PSP. Now, this is the version of the game I experienced first, and this is the game that showed me just how powerful Sony's little portable was. I was really blown away at how complex the level design was from an aesthetic standpoint, and how well it ran given the full 3D world with much less of the dialed back features you tend to see on other PSP games. On the console's sharp little screen, this game really shines, but I was surprised to see just how good the game looked upscaled through the FrameMeister and zoomed in a good amount. Going from the internal screen to the PSP Slim's component video output brings two flaws with it though, but if you ask me, they are pretty minute. First off are these horizontal lines visible throughout the picture. Now, I couldn't really tell you why these are here since I've never seen them in any other PSP game, but they really didn't bother me much at all. If that's something you won't be able to live with though, I'd say the PSP screen is the best bet for you. Second are the more muted colors. Now, I'm not really sure if this is a result of the video passing through an analog converter or just the PSP screen masking some of this issue, but you will notice less overall color depth and some washout with the black levels, which again is not a big deal at all given the fact that playing PSP games zoomed in on a big screen is novel enough to forgive a lot. As you can see here, the PS2 release isn't just a straight port, as details have been added in the environments and 3D models, but to be honest, I think I kind of prefer the PSP version. Not only is it a cool novelty playing portable games on a crisp upscale 1080p picture, but the game seems to run faster and control better than the PS2 release. That being said, both are solid choices, and I kind of struggle to stay objective with this one. I mean, if we're being technical here, this is on the low end as far as what the PS2 is capable of, but I can't help but be impressed with its portable origins. Maybe I'm just a sucker for these type of portable remasters, since I had a similar problem being critical in my review of Resident Evil Revelations. Well, regardless, Silent Hill Origins may not stack up to the other games in the series visually speaking, but it does a solid job of trying to. So much of this game just feels like a proper homage to the series' typical look, and maybe they didn't get all the way there, but in this day and age, a Western developed game getting this close to that Silent Hill look is no small accomplishment.
Daddy, wake up. Please, Daddy.
I'm not sleeping, son.
And I think that's a perfect analogy for every part of this game. Each element included, minus the more modern implements like QTEs and an on-screen weapon inventory, all look like a very good copy of what Team Silent was going for in their games. No, it definitely doesn't meet the incredibly high standards set by the series' original creators, but it feels like a work of supreme appreciation. The one and only real issue I have with the game is its story. Sure, Travis's tale is by no means boring or unentertaining in any way, but it's the elements that are supposed to lead into SH1 that get me. There are a ton of liberties taken here, either that or these guys really did not understand the original story. Either way, it ended up leaving a bad taste in my mouth. The inaccuracies got so bad, I ended up researching whether or not this was supposed to be some kind of soft reboot or maybe an alternate interpretation. But no, everything I found points towards this being a legit prequel, and if that truly is the case, consider that mission failed. I mean, it's an interesting enough tale, but if you're even kind of knowledgeable on SH lore, you're likely going to be too busy counting mistakes to actually get too much out of this story. Of course, it's important to note that the story here is perfect in getting you from point A to point B, and it's not the worst thing in the world, it just kind of strikes me as odd. And I know this video has been up and down, but I really do recommend this game. It may not achieve the same heights as the originals, but it gets damn close. Hell, this is by far the most Silent Hill feeling Silent Hill game made by Western developers, and even though competition isn't exactly what you would call neck and neck in that department, that's still a hefty compliment. So if you've already run through the originals more times than you can count, maybe the PSP will be a pretty serviceable method of transportation to get you back to that foggy little town. And that's about all I can say about Origins for right now, but I do want to thank you guys for supporting this series and the rest of my work. Make sure to stick around because the absolute nightmare that is SH Revelation is up next, but until then, thank you so much for watching the Silent Hill Retrospective. Hey guys, thanks for hanging out with me once again. If you love Silent Hill as much as I do, I'll have the rest of my retrospective videos linked here on screen, and I'd appreciate you popping by my Patreon page and maybe checking out how you can support more independent game analysis videos just like this one. But outside of all that, I want to make sure you guys are still learning. No matter what your age is, just try to learn something new today. I'm currently moving from learning how to read hiragana to katakana, and let me assure you there is no better feeling than really wrapping your head around something new and interesting. Well, peace out guys. I will see all of you again next time. Mwah.